almost 700 years ago, two big things happened in Europe, or were going on in Europe. And the first one was the bubonic plague. And the other one was a booming global trade market. And the global trade routes all seemed to run through the dominion of Venice. Now, after a while, the Venetians figured out that the plague was brought to their city by all the merchant ships coming into port. So, being wise leaders, the Doge and his council put an emergency public health measures in place that mandated that all ships entering the harbor sit in the water isolated for 40 days. 40 days seemed like a good, long period of time. 40 was a reliable number, they figured, because of its biblical significance. Noah and the animals and Noah's family were all on the ark for 40 days and 40 nights while it rained. The Hebrew people spent 40 years in the desert after leaving Egypt, and Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, in the wilderness, while he was thinking about going into the ministry. And I totally understand that. To the medieval Christians, of all these long periods of flood, wandering, and prayer were times of discernment and spiritual cleansing that helped the earth by healing it. Surely, if the trade ships in their harbor were isolated for 40 days and 40 nights, the merchandise could come ashore free of pestilence. That's what they figured. Now, it just so happens that the Italian word for 40 is quaranta, and the word for days is giorni. So a period of 40 days became, this is my Italian, quarantina. And bada bing, bada boom, we have the word quarantine, and proof positive once again that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But let's get back to that number 40. It's an important number. Specifically, let's spend some time with the 40 years the Hebrew people wandered through the desert after liberating themselves from Egypt. The Jewish holiday of Passover is coming up this week. It's on Wednesday. It starts on Wednesday, and it's the holiday that remembers the story of the Exodus. It celebrates that freedom, that liberation. Now, you might remember how the story goes. With Moses seeing the burning bush, I am what I am, going to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh saying, no, no, no. All the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, wandering through the desert, worshiping the golden calf, the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, and finally the Promised Land. And if you see Charleston Heston striding majestically through all that, well, then you're not far off. In these days of coronavirus, in these days of coronavirus pandemic, we can reflect on many parts of the Passover story through a slightly different lens. In the story, the people leave Egypt, or as it's described in the ritual, they leave Mitzrayim, the narrow place. The story begins in tight constriction. It begins in dire straits. It begins with enslavement, plagues, sickness, death. Mitzrayim, the narrow place. And when they left that narrow place, They didn't know where they were going. They didn't have time to fully prepare for the journey of discernment and transformation. They just knew they had to leave the place they were, and this was their chance. So today, we're both in the narrow place and in the 40 years of wandering, the quarantine. We're held captives in our own homes, restricted in physical movement, restricted in touch, masks hiding our faces from one another, self-isolation, quarantine. We've entered this journey unprepared. We don't know how to do this. Nobody has ever done it before, and we don't know when the journey will end. We don't even know who we will be when the journey ends. But in this season of springtime and rebirth, after the icy death, we explore this theme of liberation, which is this month's theme. In this season of springtime, let's remember that the 40 years of wandering was a time of waiting. Yes, it was a time of running through all those emotions of whining, complaining, muttering, mutiny. A time of making deals with false gods. A time when we might forget our blessings, even as they rain down on us like manna from heaven. Let's remember, this is a time for digging down into the soul, going through all those emotions and coming out the other side. Because a period of 40 days and 40 nights, or longer as the case may be, a period of 40 days and 40 nights can be a time of discernment, prayer, and cleansing. So we may, in time, emerge into our own promise of wholeness and health. That land beyond the Jordan, that promised land, that country of freedom and dignity and laughter, you carry it inside you all the time. It is planted in your mind and in your heart. It's there already. Our task is to discover the land beyond the narrow place. Our task is to open up the doors of our souls, push on looming wooden arches, on heavy iron bars, brace our shoulders against the weight of history unmoved, slough off the musty smell of unused joy. Slough off all that pent-up sorrow and let your breath precede you into a new day. May our hearts be with those who live in the narrow place and have not yet found liberation. Those who hold tight to resentment and anger. Those who refuse to open their hearts. Those locked in the grip of addiction. Those held firm by fear. Those in prisons and jails around the world. and those especially living in solitary confinement. In this springtime of rising beauty and lengthening days, may we, through our own liberation, be instruments for the liberation of all.